Nara had always been the quiet soul of the village, her presence marked by a calm that few understood and fewer appreciated. She moved through the dusty streets with a gentle grace, her dark hair falling loosely over her shoulders, her eyes carrying a depth that spoke of unseen thoughts and long-held patience. But calmness, in a village rife with envy and fear, often became a mark of suspicion. For years, whispers had followed her every step. Mothers warned their children to stay away from her, and men muttered under their breath, unsettled by the unshakable dignity she carried. It was this quiet dignity that drew the jealous glares of her neighbors, a simmering resentment that would soon turn to cruelty. The morning the order came, the village square was already alive with murmurs and half-formed accusations. Nara had been summoned by the elders, their faces stern, their eyes cold with a judgment that carried no true understanding. They told her, without preamble, that she was to guard the gallows. The task was simple in its description but devastating in its intention. She was to sit by the wooden structure where criminals were hanged, day and night if required, ensuring no one interfered with the executions. To the villagers, it seemed a neutral duty, a necessary role for the enforcement of law. But to Nara, it was a mark of humiliation, a public statement that she was to be shamed, a reminder of their power over her. As she walked toward the gallows for the first time, the air was heavy with the scent of wood and dried earth, mingled with the distant tang of sweat and smoke from cooking fires. The sun beat down mercilessly, casting long shadows across the village that seemed to stretch toward her, as if even the land itself wished to mock her. Children peeked from behind fences, their small faces a mixture of fear and fascination, while elders shook their heads knowingly, as if each step she took was a confirmation of her supposed fall from favor. The gallows stood at the edge of the village, a crude platform of aged wood, darkened by years of exposure and the stains of countless tragedies. The ropes hung like snakes, thick and unforgiving, ready to fulfill their grim purpose. Nara approached cautiously, her fingers brushing against the rough wood, feeling the coarse texture that seemed to carry the weight of every soul that had met their end there. She imagined their final moments, the panic in their eyes, the final gasps that echoed against the stillness of the clearing. Each image was a knife to her heart, but she would not let it show. Her task was meant to humiliate, to break her spirit, and she refused to give them that satisfaction. Around her, the village continued its rhythm, indifferent to her silent struggle. Women pounded grain, their hands moving with mechanical efficiency, their eyes occasionally darting toward her as if measuring her endurance. Men repaired fences, traded goods and carried water, each movement a subtle reminder that life went on without pause, indifferent to suffering. The wind whispered through the sparse trees, rustling dry leaves in a sound that seemed to mimic the low, bitter laughter of the villagers. Yet in this harsh environment, Nara found a strange clarity. Every insult, every pointed stare, became a challenge she accepted silently, her mind sharpening like steel forged by fire. As the sun climbed higher, casting the village in a harsh, almost blinding light, Nara positioned herself near the gallows. She stood erect, her eyes scanning the horizon, her posture betraying none of the humiliation intended. Children, emboldened by curiosity, wandered closer, only to be quickly shooed away by their parents. The villagers whispered among themselves, commenting on her perceived defiance, yet none dared approach her directly. There was a subtle shift in the air around her, a quiet tension that seemed to recognize her resilience even before anyone admitted it aloud. Nara's days by the gallows became a test of endurance, not just of her body but of her spirit. The platform was unforgiving, the sun and rain alike would beat down upon her, yet she remained steadfast. Birds landed nearby, unaware of the human drama unfolding, and even the wind seemed to pause in respect as it swept past. At times she felt the weight of their eyes, a suffocating presence that sought to diminish her, but she turned that weight inward, transforming it into a silent fortitude. Every hour spent by the ropes, every whispered insult, every sneer and sideways glance became a layer of armor, invisible but unyielding. By evening, as the village settled into the quiet hum of twilight, the gallows took on a new aspect in Nara's perception. No longer merely an instrument of humiliation, it became a place of vigilance, a station where she bore witness to the fragility of human morality and the persistence of cruelty. The shadows lengthened and the first stars appeared, casting a silver glow that danced on the weathered wood. Nara felt the weight of her task, but with it came a profound awareness. Though intended to belittle her, the role gave her insight into the very nature of those who sought to harm her. Each night, as she returned to her small dwelling, her body weary but her spirit unbroken, Nara understood the paradox of her assignment. The gallows, meant to shame, instead sharpened her mind and strengthened her resolve. The villagers, with their petty envy and cruelty, had unknowingly provided her with a stage to cultivate patience, endurance, and quiet dignity. She would endure silently, and in doing so she discovered a resilience that no humiliation could touch, a strength that would, in time, change the very fabric of the village itself. Long before the villagers had decided to humiliate her, Nara had lived a life defined by quiet purpose. Her days were filled with acts of care that went largely unnoticed, though their effects lingered in the lives of those she helped. She had a natural talent for tending the sick, a knowledge passed down from her grandmother who had been revered in the village as a healer. Nara learned early how to mix herbs, to soothe fevers with poultices, to ease the pain of aching limbs with gentle hands. Her skill was precise, almost instinctive, and those who found themselves under her care often recovered with remarkable speed. Yet she never sought praise or recognition. She performed her work with a humility that some mistook for meekness, unaware that it concealed a formidable strength of character. Her courage was another quiet hallmark of her life. When a fire once broke out near the river's edge, threatening the homes of several families, it was Nara who rushed forward, pulling children from the smoke and dragging baskets of water to douse the flames. She never hesitated, never counted the personal risk, and though her actions were eventually noticed, she never bragged. People spoke of her bravery in hushed tones, often exaggerating the danger she had faced, but Nara brushed off the accolades, insisting that she had only done what anyone would have done. Yet it was in these moments, in her calm decisiveness, that envy began to take root among certain villagers who could not reconcile their own mediocrity with her quiet excellence. Nara's reputation for fairness added to the grudges she silently accumulated. She had a knack for resolving disputes without creating new ones, a rare gift in a community often divided by petty arguments and old grudges. Families would seek her advice on matters of property, on disagreements between neighbors, and even on personal quarrels, trusting her judgment because it was devoid of personal interest. Her decisions were measured and impartial, guided by principles she held dear rather than favoritism. Yet fairness, in a village rife with jealousy, was seen as a threat. Those who felt slighted, or who had hoped to manipulate the village to their own advantage, began to view Nara as an obstacle. Every act of impartiality, every moment she demonstrated wisdom beyond her years, became a spark of resentment in the hearts of those who hungered for control. The envy was subtle at first, manifesting in whispered comments behind her back or pointed remarks disguised as casual advice. "She thinks she is better than the rest of us," one woman muttered while collecting firewood. "She knows too much," another added, shaking her head as Nara passed by. Even some of the men, who might have otherwise respected her, allowed suspicion to color their interactions. It was as if her competence and calm had created a mirror, reflecting their own insecurities back at them, and they could not endure the reflection. Over time, the whispers evolved into deliberate actions meant to undermine her. Small slights became orchestrated schemes. Opportunities for her to be humiliated were created and circulated, always with the intention of breaking the quiet dignity that seemed to radiate from her. Yet Nara, in her wisdom, never retaliated. She understood the dynamics of envy, the way it could poison hearts, and she refused to let their bitterness dictate her own behavior. Her kindness remained consistent, her courage unshaken, and her fairness unwavering. Children continued to seek her guidance, drawn to her calm and gentle presence. Elders occasionally relied on her for advice, even while muttering complaints about how much influence she seemed to wield. And those in need of healing, whether physical or emotional, trusted her without hesitation. In every interaction she maintained a balance that few could emulate, a blend of humility and strength that made her quietly indispensable. Even as jealousy grew among certain villagers, it never managed to touch the core of who Nara was. She remembered, often with a smile to herself, the lessons her grandmother had imparted. One in particular resonated deeply, that true strength did not announce itself through violence or loud declarations, but through patience, consistency, and compassion. This philosophy shaped every decision, every action, and every encounter she had. While others sought recognition through manipulation or intimidation, Nara's strength was a silent force, building resilience and creating bonds that could not easily be broken. It was this same quiet strength that, in time, would make her humiliation at the gallows so ironic. The villagers who sought to belittle her could not see that the very qualities they envied, her skill, her courage, her fairness, were the sources of an inner power that no rope, no public shaming could diminish. The envy that once poisoned their hearts would soon become the mechanism through which her endurance and dignity were revealed. And Nara, aware of this truth even as she endured their schemes, held herself with the same calm she had always maintained, knowing that the judgment of the petty could never define her worth. As the memory of her past unfolded, it became clear that Nara had been preparing unknowingly for this very trial. Each act of healing, each brave gesture, each decision guided by fairness had built an invisible armor, layer by layer, forging a resilience that would carry her through the harshest days by the gallows. The villagers, in their envy and cruelty, had underestimated her entirely. They had assumed that humiliation could shatter her spirit, never realizing that her quiet strength had been nurtured through years of selfless courage and steadfast integrity. And as Nara stood by the gallows once more, recalling the life that had shaped her, there was a certainty in her heart. She would endure, and in enduring she would reveal a power they could neither comprehend nor contain. Even as Nara went about her quiet routines, unseen forces were at work, shaping a tide of resentment that would soon crash over her. Among the villagers and a few petty officials, envy had hardened into deliberate malice, a slow-burning fire that sought a target. They spoke in hushed tones behind closed doors, their whispers curling around the walls like smoke, carrying intentions sharp and cruel. Every glance exchanged between them was loaded with schemes, every sigh a subtle plotting. It was as if the village had quietly conspired to concentrate all its spite on one figure, the one who embodied what they could neither destroy nor emulate. The primary antagonists were a mix of men and women whose grievances ranged from personal slights to feelings of inadequacy in the face of Nara's unassuming competence. There was Akani, a village elder whose authority had begun to wane with age, who could not bear the idea that a young woman could inspire more respect than he commanded. He murmured to anyone who would listen that Nara's calm and fairness were unnatural, suggesting that she must be hiding motives that no one could trust. His voice carried the weight of perceived wisdom, lending credibility to ideas that were otherwise petty. Beside him stood Tola, a merchant whose greed often put him at odds with the community. Tola envied Nara's reputation for honesty and fairness, knowing that her integrity made his own manipulations less effective. He whispered accusations of favoritism and subtle manipulation, careful to frame them as cautionary advice, hoping to sway others to his side. Among the women, a similar discontent simmered. Yara, known for her sharp tongue and ambition, could not reconcile her desire for recognition with the quiet esteem Nara commanded. She whispered in the marketplace, planting seeds of doubt about Nara's intentions, suggesting that the calm woman's actions were calculated and self-serving. Her words, often framed as concern for the village's well-being, were carefully chosen to stoke fear and mistrust without appearing overtly malicious. The subtlety of these whispers allowed them to spread unnoticed, weaving a network of suspicion and resentment that even the most neutral villagers could not fully escape. Together, these antagonists crafted a narrative, a story they repeated and refined until it seemed indisputable. Nara, the gallows guard, was a figure to be tested, a woman who could be broken under the weight of public humiliation. They told each other that if anyone could falter under the harsh scrutiny of the villagers, it would be her. "She is too proud," Akani said one evening, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. "She may walk quietly, speak softly, but no spirit can withstand such shame for long. When the gallows call, we shall see her break." Tola nodded, adding, "We must ensure she knows her place. Let the village watch. Let her struggle. If she bends, the lesson will be clear to all." Their plotting became almost ritualistic, repeated in whispers during market days at the wells, and even during communal meals. The atmosphere of secrecy gave their malice power. Even those who had no personal grievances against Nara were drawn into the narrative, curious and fearful of what might come to pass. The whispers became a web, connecting one villager to another, until suspicion and excitement mingled with cruelty, forming an undercurrent that coursed through the village. Children overheard fragments of conversations, internalizing cautionary tales of what might happen if one strayed from their assigned role. Adults looked for signs of weakness in Nara's demeanor, waiting, almost eagerly, for the moment when she might falter. The gallows, already a grim structure, took on an even more ominous weight in the collective imagination, transformed by the conspirators' expectations of failure. Some of the antagonists derived private satisfaction from their schemes. Yara would smirk to herself when she imagined the villagers laughing at Nara, while Tola felt a sense of control over a situation he could otherwise not dominate. Akani, though outwardly measured, relished the thought that his authority might be reinforced by Nara's submission. Each act of plotting, each whispered rumor, served to sharpen their perception of themselves as architects of consequence, capable of bending the quiet woman to their will. Yet in their arrogance, They failed to perceive the depth of her resilience, the inner strength that had been forged over years of careful living, courage, and compassion. Their discussions often circled back to the gallows itself, the site that would, in their minds, become both a stage and a weapon. "Place her there," Tola would insist, "and the village will see what becomes of those who think themselves above reproach." "Yes," Yara added, her voice silky and venomous, "and she will crumble. The rope is heavy with meaning, let it teach her humility." Akani would nod solemnly, imagining the spectacle of a dignified woman reduced to trembling, a public lesson etched into memory. The plan, they believed, was flawless, their combined malice a force unstoppable in its precision and intent. And yet, their plotting carried an irony they could not foresee. Every whisper, every schemed humiliation, was feeding the very thing they sought to destroy. In their obsession with breaking Nara, they were creating the conditions under which her endurance, her quiet strength, and her unyielding dignity would shine most brightly. The malice, meant to wound, was planting the seeds for her eventual revelation, the moment when the village would witness that true power is not found in envy or cruelty, but in resilience, integrity, and calm perseverance. The day of the gallows preparation dawned with a heavy, oppressive sky, the clouds hanging low as if even the heavens understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. Villagers gathered in hushed clusters, their whispers creating a low hum that seemed to vibrate through the very air. From a distance, one could see the wooden platform rising at the edge of the clearing, crude yet commanding in its presence. The structure had been built with care, each beam measured and placed with precision, each nail driven home with the intention of permanence. There was a sense of ritual in the assembly, a meticulousness that made the grim purpose of the gallows all the more pronounced. The rope, thick and coiled like a serpent ready to strike, hung ominously from the crossbeam. Its fibers were rough and heavy, smelling faintly of tar and earth, and it carried the invisible weight of countless lives that had passed through its grip. As the villagers handled it, adjusting its length and knot, their movements were careful, almost reverent, acknowledging the deadly seriousness of their task. Even the most callous onlookers could not escape the gravity that seemed to radiate from the rope itself, the way it twisted and hung with quiet authority. Some whispered superstitions, speaking of the rope as though it bore a consciousness of its own, a silent witness to human folly and cruelty. The air was thick with tension, a pressure that seemed to press down on every shoulder in the clearing. Each villager carried a mixture of curiosity, excitement, and fear, emotions intertwined in a complex web. Some approached the gallows out of duty, others out of a morbid fascination with the potential spectacle. Children were kept at a distance, yet their wide eyes and hushed questions betrayed a curiosity that mirrored the unspoken anticipation of the adults. The smell of dust, mixed with smoke from distant cooking fires, created an atmosphere that was simultaneously mundane and ominous, a reminder that life and death coexisted uneasily in the same space. Nara arrived at the clearing with a poise that contrasted sharply with the uneasy energy around her. She walked with steady steps, her dark hair catching the faint breeze, her posture upright, her eyes calm and observant. There was a rhythm to her movement, a quiet assurance that seemed to slow time itself in the immediate space around her. Villagers stole glances, some in disbelief at her composure, others with barely concealed disdain. The elders' whispers spoke of her impending humiliation, yet Nara remained untouched by their malice. Every eye upon her was a test she met without flinching, every murmured comment absorbed and transformed into a silent strength. Approaching the gallows, she ran her fingers along the coarse wood, feeling the grooves and imperfections under her touch. The texture was rough, unyielding, yet she allowed herself a moment of reflection, considering the lives that had passed through this space, the final moments of those who had been bound and judged. The rope swung gently with the wind as if anticipating its next duty, and she could feel the weight of history pressing down upon her shoulders. It was not a weight she resented nor one she feared, but rather a presence she acknowledged, a force to be respected and met with unwavering composure. The preparation continued around her, the villagers bustling with nervous energy. Some carried tools, hammering and adjusting the structure, while others held themselves in rigid anticipation, eager for the day's events to unfold. The air seemed to vibrate with a collective tension, a sense that something momentous and irreversible was imminent. Even the animals in the vicinity sensed it. Chickens clucked nervously, dogs shifted uneasily, and the wind carried a chill that seemed out of place for the season. All these details, subtle and pervasive, wove a tapestry of fear and anticipation, yet Nara remained an island of calm amidst the storm. As she took her position, the sun climbed higher, casting stark shadows across the clearing. The rope's fibers glinted faintly, and the platform's edges seemed sharper under the sunlight. Villagers fell silent, the murmurs ceasing as the moment of commencement drew near. Nara's eyes swept across the gathering crowd, noting the faces filled with anticipation, judgment, and envy. There was no flinching in her gaze, no sign of panic or self-doubt. She breathed evenly, her body aligned with a rhythm that seemed independent of the chaos around her, and in that stillness she asserted a quiet dominance that went unnoticed by many yet palpable to those who truly observed. The gallows, heavy with the rope and anticipation, became more than a structure. It was a symbol of authority, fear, and societal cruelty. Yet in Nara's presence, it also became a measure of her endurance. She understood the role she had been assigned, the humiliation that was intended, and the scrutiny under which she would operate. But rather than recoiling, she embraced the responsibility with serene determination. Every detail, the rope's weight, the platform's edges, the villagers' restless energy, was met with a composed vigilance, an unwavering presence that suggested strength beyond physicality, a fortitude rooted in her character, patience, and the quiet knowledge that endurance is a form of power. As the day pressed on, the villagers' whispered predictions of her failure clashed against her calm reality. Nara had become the center of their attention not through boastfulness but through her silent poise. The gallows, a tool of humiliation in their minds, was instead becoming a testament to her composure. The weight of the rope, the structure's crude permanence, and the fearful tension in the air, all these elements combined to create a setting of dread, yet none could penetrate the calm that radiated from Nara. She stood ready, steady, and unbroken, her quiet strength a silent challenge to those who sought to diminish her. As Nara maintained her vigil beside the gallows, subtle details began to catch her attention, hints that the rope was more than an ordinary instrument of punishment. At first, it was the way it seemed to quiver when a villager whispered spitefully, the fibers stirring as though stirred by the weight of their intentions. She noticed it almost subconsciously, her eyes briefly flicking to the rope whenever a particularly venomous remark passed through the crowd. The movement was faint, a delicate shiver along the twisted strands, easily dismissed by anyone who was not watching closely. Yet Nara, attuned to small, almost imperceptible shifts in her environment, felt a faint unease mingled with curiosity. Later, as the sun climbed higher and shadows stretched long across the clearing, the rope seemed to respond to tension in the air. When a particularly arrogant man stepped forward, puffing out his chest and smirking in anticipation of her discomfort, the rope swung slightly as if nudged by an unseen hand. The motion was subtle but undeniable. Nara's gaze softened, a flicker of recognition passing over her features. There was a rhythm to its movements, almost like a pulse, syncing with the emotional currents of the villagers. Fear, malice, and anticipation. Each sentiment seemed to send vibrations along the fibers, and the rope responded in kind. It was not merely an inanimate object, but a vessel for a force she could not yet name. Even the way it caught the wind was different. Normally, ropes swung or twisted according to the breeze, following simple physical laws. But this rope seemed to anticipate the air, moving in delicate arcs that suggested intention. When a child ran too close, laughing nervously, the rope shifted just slightly as though aware of the innocence near it. When someone glared at Nara, eager for her to flinch, the rope stiffened, a subtle rigidity that made its presence seem heavier, more deliberate. Nara observed these small changes with calm attention, noting how the rope's reactions often mirrored the villagers' hidden intentions, yet did so without malice toward her. It was as if the rope had its own sense of justice, aligning with the unseen moral balance of the moment. As the day progressed, the rope's unusual nature became increasingly difficult to ignore. When a group of women approached the gallows, whispering about how Nara would surely falter, the rope twisted lightly, almost imperceptibly, like it was preparing for something, a subtle warning embedded in its fibers. Nara did not react outwardly, but she felt a curious resonance in her chest, a gentle hum of awareness that suggested the rope was observing, understanding, and perhaps even judging the atmosphere around it. Her intuition, honed over years of careful observation and quiet strength, told her that this was no ordinary instrument of execution. Something ancient, sentient, and protective seemed entwined in its very threads. Even the villagers, unaware of these subtle movements, seemed affected in small ways. When the rope reacted to their malicious intentions, they hesitated ever so slightly, a fleeting pause in the rhythm of their plotting. Some crossed themselves or muttered half-formed prayers, sensing vaguely that the gallows held more than mere wood and fiber. Nara, however, watched with clarity and calm, understanding that the rope's response was not aimed to intimidate or punish at this moment, but to convey presence, awareness, and a readiness to act should injustice truly prevail. There were moments when the rope seemed to resonate in harmony with Nara herself. When she took a deep breath and stood fully upright, her calm aura touching the tense air around her, the rope twined gently as if acknowledging her poise. A single strand would sway, catching the light in a way that seemed almost deliberate, and a faint shiver would run along its length, like a message only the attentive could perceive. In these moments, Nara felt a connection, subtle yet undeniable, a recognition that the rope's sentience was aligned with the moral currents she carried within her. It did not act for cruelty, nor did it serve the whims of the envious. Instead, it seemed bound to a higher, unseen sense of balance. Even as the villagers continued to whisper and plot, unaware of the signs before them, the rope's reactions became increasingly vivid. When a man cursed under his breath, hoping for her shame, the fibers twisted slightly as if recoiling from his words. When someone approached with fear in their eyes, the rope softened in motion, gentle yet perceptive. It was as though the gallows, intended as a site of humiliation, had become a living entity, sensitive to moral alignment and emotional truth. Nara watched, fascinated yet composed, noting the rope's subtle communications. Every shift, every quiver was a message, a prelude to events yet to unfold, a promise that the rope would not act unjustly, and that it recognized her steadfast spirit. By the afternoon, a faint understanding had settled within Nara. The rope was more than an instrument, it was a sentinel, a guardian threaded with awareness. It responded to malice, to fear, to tension, and to integrity. Though its nature was still mysterious, she felt no fear. Instead, a quiet confidence bloomed within her. The villagers' plots and whispered cruelty could no longer touch her in the same way. She understood that a greater presence observed the unfolding events. The rope, in its subtle, almost imperceptible ways, was both witness and arbiter, foreshadowing the role it would play when the time of reckoning arrived. The villagers gathered near the gallows, their whispers a steady murmur that carried cruelty disguised as curiosity. They had come not to honor duty or witness justice, but to delight in the possibility of Nara faltering under the weight of her task. She stood by the looming wooden frame, her figure upright, her expression calm. Yet beneath that poise she could feel the eyes on her, searching for weakness, hoping to find cracks in her strength. The sun cast long shadows across the square, gilding the noose with a grim light, and the people circled closer, emboldened by each other's scorn. One of the men, tall and sharp-eyed, smirked as he called out a jest, mocking her presence beside the rope. "Do you think it will spare you if you smile at it, girl?" he sneered, laughter spilling from his lips and catching among the crowd. Another woman, her voice sharp as a reed pipe, added, "She will run before the day is over. Mark my words, her spirit will crumble." Their barbs were designed to pierce, to unravel the dignity that Nara held so tightly within herself. But she did not waver. Her gaze was fixed on the rope, its fibers twisted with care, its loop swaying slightly though the air was still. The villagers mistook her silence for weakness, and their mockery grew louder, crueler. Someone tossed a handful of dirt at her feet, and another spat in the dust, declaring that the task of guarding the gallows was cursed. They wanted her to recoil, to break under the weight of their contempt. Instead, she stood as steady as the wooden beams that framed her post. It was then that the rope stirred. Not enough for the villagers to notice, but enough for Nara to sense. The loop twisted ever so slightly, as though responding to the venom in the air. The fibers creaked faintly, a sound softer than a breath yet sharp to her ears, like a warning or a murmur of agreement with her unspoken resolve. Her eyes flickered, catching that subtle motion, but she kept her face unreadable. To the villagers she remained a statue of composure, but inside, a shiver of recognition passed through her. The taunts grew bolder. A young man, brash and eager to impress the others, stepped forward and tried to shove her shoulder, hoping to see her stumble before the crowd. But his foot caught unexpectedly on the wooden step of the platform, sending him lurching awkwardly forward. He caught himself at the last moment, but the stumble drew laughter from those around him, laughter directed not at Nara but at his own clumsiness. His face flushed with humiliation, and he glared at her as though she were to blame. Yet Nara had not moved a muscle, it was as though the space around her had shifted in her favor. The rope swayed again, more visibly this time, as though mocking the failed attempt at her disgrace. A few in the crowd glanced at it with unease, muttering that perhaps the gallows had grown restless. But most dismissed it, choosing instead to continue their jeers. Still, the seed of doubt had been sown, a faint uneasiness threading itself through the mob. Nara felt it too. Not fear but awareness. The rope was not lifeless hemp. It was listening, watching, responding. She could not yet say how or why, but she sensed that it did not tolerate cruelty lightly. It moved when injustice sharpened in the air, as though feeding on malice and bending it back toward its source. So when another villager shouted at her, calling her cursed and unworthy, she simply let the insult pass over her like wind through reeds. The rope creaked again, this time with a note almost like laughter, a dry, hollow sound that sent a few children scurrying behind their mothers' skirts. The boldness of the crowd faltered slightly, though they covered it with nervous laughter. Nara's stillness became its own defiance. The more they tried to humiliate her, the more the rope seemed to hum with a presence beyond their understanding. And though they did not yet see the danger, a quiet balance had shifted. Their malice was no longer striking her alone. It was awakening something else, something bound and waiting above their heads. The conspirators gathered near the gallows with false confidence, their laughter sharp and brittle in the tense air. They had expected this day to be one of triumph, a public spectacle that would not only break Nara's spirit but remind everyone in the village of their authority. Yet as the hours passed, a subtle shift unsettled them. The rope, meant to symbolize their control, no longer seemed still. When no wind blew, it swayed gently, its fibers twisting as though it breathed. One man, who had mocked Nara earlier, felt an odd shiver when he walked beneath it, like the rope had dropped a shadow upon him that pressed harder than sunlight ever could. Another conspirator swore he saw it twitch, tightening slightly when his hand brushed against the wood of the gallows. He laughed nervously to cover his unease, but his companions noticed his hand trembling as he pulled it away. At first, they dismissed these incidents as imagination. They told each other that the rope was simply drying in the heat, shrinking as fibers often do. Yet deep inside, unease spread. The youngest among them whispered that it looked like a snake coiling, its loops tightening with hunger. His words earned him a sharp rebuke, but the others shared glances that betrayed their own doubts. The rope seemed heavier than before, its length hanging with a gravity that drew the eye and filled the chest with dread. Even the platform boards creaked strangely, as if groaning beneath an invisible weight. They began watching Nara closely, hoping to see her falter, but her calmness only heightened their discomfort. She stood like a quiet flame, untouched by their malice, her gaze steady as though she knew a secret they did not. Some swore that the rope seemed gentler in her presence, swaying less, hanging quieter, as if acknowledging her composure. Yet when one of the conspirators approached too close, sneering insults, the rope gave a faint jerk, sudden enough to make him stumble back with a startled gasp. Laughter followed, but it was thin and cracked. No one dared to mention the obvious. The rope was not behaving like a tool. It was watching, judging. By nightfall, the conspirators avoided lingering beneath the gallows. They found excuses to keep distance, whispering instead of laughing, their voices carrying unease. Each step closer brought with it a weight in the chest, a suffocating pressure as though the rope recognized their guilt. The eldest conspirator, who prided himself on never bowing to fear, felt the rope twitch when he laid a hand upon the beam, and for the first time, his breath caught. Something unseen was stirring, and though they tried to bury the thought, all of them began to feel it. The gallows was no longer theirs to command. The rope had chosen its own silence, and its silence was heavy with threat. The night air carried whispers, heavy and uneasy, as Nara stood with the rope coiled beside her like a silent sentinel. She no longer regarded it as a mere tool of punishment or symbol of dread. There was something alive in its quiet movements, something she had begun to feel deep in her bones. The villagers passing by expected her to tremble, to shrink from her post, but instead she held herself steady, her eyes calm, her breaths measured. It was not bravado, rather, it was the dawning sense that she was not standing alone. The rope, coiled and hanging as if asleep, seemed to echo her composure, responding to her steady stillness with a rare quietude, as though her calm had become its anchor. When men tried to test her by stepping too close, sneering at her resolve, the rope gave the faintest twitch, enough to make them hesitate mid-step. It did not lash out wildly, it moved with the kind of precision that could not be coincidence. Nara caught the subtle shifts, the way its fibers seemed to tense whenever cruelty was near, loosening again when the tension dissipated. Instead of flinching, she simply observed, her gaze lowering to the rope with quiet recognition. She had learned the rhythm of its responses, the difference between stillness born of rest and stillness charged with expectation. There were moments when the conspirators lingered, whispering behind her back, thinking her too naive to catch the glances they exchanged. Yet she noticed how their voices faltered when the rope gave a sudden creak, how their laughter broke when its coils shivered against the wooden beam. Nara did not feed the tension with her own fear. Instead, she let her silence speak, her posture unyielding. Her serenity contrasted so sharply with their unease that even those who had mocked her before began to feel as though she commanded something unseen. Children, curious and bold, crept near the gallows during the day, hoping to see her flinch. They threw pebbles at the post or muttered cruel names, but Nara only watched them with steady eyes, not angered, not wounded. The rope remained still under her watch, as though it too respected her restraint. Yet when one child, emboldened by the crowd's snickers, reached out to tug its end, the rope twitched sharply, jerking back like a serpent warning a hand away from fire. The children shrieked and scattered, and Nara neither scolded nor laughed. She simply stood, allowing the moment to pass, her stillness more powerful than any outburst. At night, when shadows stretched long and the air turned cold, Nara could almost feel the rope's pulse, subtle but undeniable, as if it waited for her lead. Her composure did not falter, for she had begun to see a strange balance in their connection. Where others brought malice, the rope grew restless. Where she brought calm, it settled. It was not submission nor domination. It was harmony, a bond shaped by mutual recognition. And so she remained serene, even when threats were hissed at her from the dark, even when the villagers willed her to break. Her calm became more than personal strength. It was a quiet command, an unspoken guidance that seemed to shape the rope's intent. Each time cruelty pressed close, the rope stirred as if responding to her unvoiced judgment, punishing malice with its subtle movements, protecting her without being told. To the villagers this seemed uncanny. To Nara it felt natural. For the first time in her life she did not feel like prey in a cruel story, she felt like a quiet center in the storm, steadying not only herself but the strange sentinel bound to her. "Bro, would you like me to carry this same balance of Nara's calm guiding the rope's growing will into the next section where the rope begins to act more decisively? Or do you want the conspirators to start losing control sooner?" The day began like the others since Nara had been stationed at the gallows. The villagers moved about with a strange mixture of eagerness and dread, whispering to one another as though waiting for a spectacle. Rumors had spread quickly, rumors that the rope which hung from the beam was not just rope at all. Some said it hissed in the night, others claimed it had grown darker in shade as though it absorbed shadows, and still others swore they had seen it twitch like the tail of a living beast. Nara listened to none of these whispers openly, though she felt each word pressing against her silence. She remained steady, her back straight, her eyes calm, her breath even. The conspirators who had pushed for her punishment grew restless. Their intent had been to shame her, to grind her dignity into dust by making her the mock guardian of the gallows. But Nara had not broken. She did not shrink from the rope, nor cower when they jeered at her. If anything, her poise unsettled them more than any tears could have. Among them was Jumo, one of the loudest voices against her, a broad man with a cruel mouth that never seemed to tire of twisting insults. On this day he decided to take matters further. Stepping boldly into the square, he announced for all to hear, "What kind of guardian is this? A woman who guards the gallows like a dog tied to its post. Shall we test her worth?" His words dripped venom, meant to stir laughter and approval. A few villagers chuckled nervously, unsure if they were laughing at Nara or at their own unease. Nara stood still, her eyes neither rising to meet his nor falling to show submission. The stillness around her, however, seemed to thicken. The rope above swayed gently, though no wind passed through the square. Its fibers creaked, a low groan like an old man's bones adjusting. Some villagers looked up instinctively, shivering without knowing why. Jumo swaggered closer to Nara. "Tell us, ropekeeper, do you not fear this thing? Perhaps we should place it around your neck and see how long you last. Would you keep so calm then?" His hand shot up suddenly, grasping at the rope with mock bravado. That was when it happened. The rope did not lie limp in his grip. Instead, it seemed to come alive. It coiled swiftly, curling around his wrist like a snake snapping at prey. Jumo gasped, startled, and yanked back his arm, but the rope clung tighter. Its fibers dug into his skin, leaving thin red marks that deepened the more he struggled. His bravado dissolved into raw panic as he twisted and pulled, shouting, "Get it off me! Get it off!" The villagers erupted in chaos. Some screamed and fled from the square, while others pressed forward, eyes wide in horror and fascination. No one dared touch the rope. They remembered too well the whispered stories, and now those whispers had manifested in flesh and blood before their eyes. Jumo fell to his knees, thrashing like a man caught in quicksand. The rope tightened once, sharp and deliberate, making him choke out a cry of pain. And then, as suddenly as it had seized him, it loosened. His wrist slipped free but the mark remained, An angry welt like a branded warning. Silence fell across the square. All eyes turned to Nara. She had not moved a muscle throughout the ordeal. Her calm seemed almost otherworldly, as though she had known the rope would act. The conspirators looked at one another uneasily, their confidence shaken. This was no mere punishment of humiliation anymore. Something far larger, far stranger had been stirred. Jumo staggered to his feet, his bravado shattered. He clutched his wrist as though fearing the rope might strike again. His voice, once sharp and commanding, cracked with fear. It attacked me. The rope is cursed. The villagers muttered among themselves, their panic now feeding a different kind of fire. Some whispered that Nara had bewitched the rope, bending it to her will. Others claimed the rope had always been alive, and that placing her beside it had awakened its hunger for justice. Whatever the truth, one thing became clear. The gallows were no longer just a place of fear, they had become a place of reckoning. The elders tried to restore order, shouting that it was nothing more than tricks of the mind, that Jumo had imagined the tightening. But their words rang hollow, for too many had seen the rope move with their own eyes. The hush that followed carried weight heavier than denial. The people no longer trusted their leaders' reassurances. Through it all, Nara remained still, her gaze calm and unwavering. If she had been frightened, she gave no sign. If she had been vindicated, she showed no triumph. Instead, her presence seemed to quiet the rope itself, which once again hung motionless, as though it had returned to slumber. Yet those who watched closely swore they saw it pulse faintly, like the slow beat of a living heart. For the first time, the conspirators felt fear not just of Nara, but of what surrounded her. The rope, meant to humiliate her, had become her unspoken ally. And though the villagers did not yet say it aloud, a thought rooted itself in their minds. Perhaps the rope was not here to punish Nara at all. Perhaps it was here to punish them. The square remained unsettled long after the crowd dispersed, whispers trailing through the air like restless ghosts. Mothers pulled their children close, men avoided looking at the gallows, and those who had mocked Nara earlier kept their distance. The rope had shown its first strike, and in doing so, it had shifted the balance of fear. No longer was Nara the one mocked, tested, or diminished. Now it was the rope that held authority. And Nara, standing serene beneath its shadow, became its silent keeper, not of the gallows but of its growing, mysterious power.